"Don't look, don't mess up," single mom whispered. She warned a Mafia boss before a deadly betrayal. The first time I saw him, I didn't really see him. Not exactly. It was more like I felt something shift, as if someone had quietly turned down the volume of the world. The conversations at the nearby tables softened. The clink of cutlery against porcelain became timid, almost apologetic. Even the usually bustling chefs behind the service window slowed their rhythm, moving with the measured grace of a choreographed performance. "Table 7, Monica murmured into my ear, slipping a leather-bound menu into my damp, trembling hands. "The corner table." I followed her gaze across the dining room of the Lighthouse Table, the oldest seaside restaurant in Seaford Bay. The low-hanging glass lights cast shimmering reflections onto crisp white tablecloths, freshly pressed and impossibly clean. The corner table, the best seat in the house, always reserved but rarely occupied, now held a presence. "That's Lucas Moretti," Monica whispered, smoothing the wrinkled edge of her apron with a nervous hand. "Don't stare. And please don't make a scene." My throat tightened. In this tiny coastal town, almost everyone knew the name Lucas Moretti. Even a single mother like me, who had spent the last 4 years juggling odd jobs, raising a child, and caring for a sick mother, had heard of him. The hushed stories in the employee break room were enough to paint a picture. Lucas owned half the harbor at Seaford Bay. People who crossed him were never seen again, at least not around here. And now, there he was, seated in my section, his silhouette carved like stone against the ivory leather booth. "Why me?" I asked, nervously brushing down the folds of my black apron. "Can't you take this one?" Monica exhaled sharply. "Manager's orders. He said you're the quietest one here." She gave me a once-over, her eyes flickering with something like sympathy. "Just do what you always do, Claire. Just stay invisible. Invisible." That I could do. I had lived in invisibility for years, quietly working 2 jobs to keep my child fed, quietly sitting beside my mother's bed night after night, listening to her weakening breath, quietly shrinking from anything that might force me into the light. Invisibility had become my armor in a world too loud, too demanding. I drew a steady breath, squared my shoulders, and walked toward table 7. Seated at the center was a man whose presence filled the space so completely that I felt it before I even saw his face. On either side of him were 2 men in tailored suits, their broad shoulders and cold eyes marking them as bodyguards. But it wasn't their scrutiny that made me falter. It was the way the man in the middle didn't look at me and yet made me feel utterly exposed. His black hair was cropped close on the sides, longer at the top and falling slightly over his brow. He leaned over something on the table, maybe a phone. His white shirt was open at the collar, revealing sun-kissed skin and the sharp angles of his collarbone. No tie, yet every stitch of him radiated precision. I stopped at a respectful distance, careful not to let my shadow fall across the table. "Good evening. It's a pleasure to serve you at the Lighthouse Table." The 2 bodyguards remained still, but the man in the center lifted his head, and the air around me vanished. Lucas Moretti looked at me with eyes as dark as storm-tossed water, eyes that stripped away everything in their path. His face was sculpted like a Roman statue, all proud lines and ruthless symmetry. A square jaw, a straight nose, but it was the eyes that held me. For a fleeting moment, his gaze shifted, a flicker of surprise, something that looked like recognition. "Water," he said. His voice was low and smooth, with a touch of Italian cadence. Not a request, a command. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. I felt small and threadbare in my faded uniform. The gold watch on his wrist probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. "Would you like to hear about the specials tonight?" I asked, my voice nearly a whisper. "No," he didn't look away. "Bring a bottle of Brunello di Montalcino, 1989. And the chef's choice of appetizer." I didn't write it down. My mind was blank under the weight of his stare. "Is there a problem?" "No, sir." I lowered my head and repeated the order. 1 bottle of Brunello, vintage 1989, and the appetizer, chosen by our chef. I'll be right back." As I turned, his voice followed me. "What's your name?" I paused, my heartbeat stumbling. "Claire, sir." "Not tonight." A faint smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Tonight you're Clarissa." I swallowed hard, gave a slight nod, and hurried toward the bar. But I could still feel his gaze burning into my back. If you've been listening this far and felt something quietly stir inside you, please don't forget to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom channel so you won't miss the deeply moving and soulful stories we share each day. This space is created for those who have ever stayed silent, who have ever sacrificed, who have walked through days and nights unseen and unheard. If you're listening from anywhere across the United States, or even from the other side of the ocean, leave us a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from, which city, which state. Stories like Claire's are more than just narratives. They are bridges that connect us. And if you feel this story has touched you, please like and share it so it can reach even further. We would truly love to hear how it moved you. And now, let's return to the story, to that very moment when Claire and Lucas first locked eyes, when the air inside the restaurant shifted and an unexpected journey quietly began. I walked straight toward the wine counter, my hands clutching the order pad as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. Each step grew heavier than the last, as though the air inside the restaurant had thickened around me. Behind me, I could still feel Lucas Moretti's gaze, sharp and unrelenting, following my every move without apology. In 4 years of serving hundreds of guests, no one had ever made me feel so exposed, so thoroughly seen, with nothing more than a look. I handed Monica the order, my voice trembling slightly. She glanced at me, then over to table 7. "What did he say to you?" I shook my head. "Nothing important. A bottle of Brunello and the chef's appetizer." Monica didn't press further. She understood this world better than I did. She also knew when silence was the safest choice. I returned to table 7 just a few minutes later, the expensive bottle cradled in my hands, chilled beneath a folded cloth. As I approached, the 2 bodyguards remained motionless, their cold eyes brushing past me as if I were nothing more than a shadow. But Lucas was different. He looked up at me again, and this time his gaze wasn't just observing, it was dissecting, measuring, curious. I wasn't used to being looked at that way. No one had really looked at me since my mother fell ill. Since I became a single mother, juggling 2 jobs and the endless duties of a daughter, I had learned how to make myself unseen. Invisibility had become a survival skill. I carefully set the bottle on the table, offered a slight bow, and began uncorking it with the wine key. My fingers trembled faintly, but my hands remembered the motions even if my mind was spinning. Lucas never looked away. He said nothing, just watched, not with emptiness or rudeness, but with the kind of attention that made me feel undeniably present. He noticed everything: the faint scar on my left wrist, the worn silver ring I wore on my ring finger, the only thing my mother left me. I could feel the weight of his attention threading through my every movement, each breath. When I poured the wine into his glass, my hand tilted too far. A few dark drops nearly spilled over the rim. I quickly corrected myself, swallowing hard. Lucas said nothing. He simply lifted the glass, swirled it gently, and brought it to his nose. The gesture was dangerously elegant, like a predator testing the air before deciding whether to devour. I straightened, trying to steady my voice. "I'll inform the chef about the appetizer," I said, eyes on my notepad. "If you need anything else, just give a signal." "Clarissa," he said, his voice low and steady. I looked up. For the first time, our eyes met directly. The rest of the world seemed to fade. He tilted his head slightly, studying my reaction. "How long have you worked here?" I hesitated. I knew I shouldn't answer. The rules of service were clear. No personal conversations with guests, especially not guests like him. But there was something in his voice that made ignoring him impossible. "Almost 3 years," I said softly. "Before that, I took care of my mother," I said, then immediately regretted it. Too personal, too real. Lucas nodded slowly, as if confirming something in his mind. "You're very good at being quiet, Clarissa." I didn't know how to respond. He set the glass down, untouched. And sometimes those who stay silent hear more than anyone else. A chill traced the length of my spine. I lowered my head in a polite bow and turned away, heart unsteady. I didn't understand why a man like him would pay attention to someone like me, a waitress no one noticed. But somewhere deep in my chest, I knew something had shifted tonight. Something had begun, and I had just stepped into a current I couldn't turn back from. I left table 7 with a heartbeat that stumbled and stuttered, as though I had just surfaced from water too deep and too cold. Though I'd only stood there for a few minutes, it felt as if something inside me had been drained completely. The weight of Lucas Moretti's gaze still lingered on my back like a shadow that refused to lift. I returned to the service counter, where Monica was polishing a glass with her usual calm expression, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She glanced at me, then at the corner table where Lucas sat flanked by those 2 silent men. "You all right?" she asked in a voice low enough to stay beneath the hum of the restaurant. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure the answer was true. Monica didn't press. She simply slid the tray with the appetizer toward me. "Take this out before they start waiting." I took a deep breath, straightened my apron, and made my way back to table 7. My hands still trembled slightly, but I forced my body into the rhythm of calm. As I drew near, I noticed the silence at that table wasn't the usual kind found between courses or during thoughtful conversation. It was deliberate, watchful, tense. The two men who had been seated with Lucas had shifted positions. One had moved to a nearby table, his back to the window, though his eyes never stopped scanning the dining room. The other had risen, creating space. And Lucas, still at the center, sat relaxed in posture, but the appraisal in his eyes from earlier had vanished. Now there was only a gaze that spoke of conclusions already drawn. I set the tray down, poured the wine for the two men, and began plating the appetizer with steady hands. I was leaning slightly forward when I heard his voice again, still low and smooth, but this time with something cold threaded through it. No one approaches this table without clearance. I froze. One beat of silence. A skipped heartbeat. I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or his men, but the message was clear. The atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't a luxurious evening for a distinguished guest anymore. Something else was taking shape here, quiet and dangerous. I stepped back, bowed my head slightly. "I won't disturb you further." Lucas didn't answer. He lifted his glass and sipped as though everything was ordinary, but his eyes betrayed the lie. They were no longer focused on me. They were sweeping the restaurant with a hunter's stillness, watching for movement like a predator surveying the edge of his territory. I walked away, but didn't return fully to the service counter. Instead, I paused behind one of the stone pillars near the edge of the dining room, pretending to wipe down a nearby table. Something inside me, a quiet but insistent instinct, urged me to watch, to stay close, to pay attention. There was something wrong, not obvious, not nameable, but real. Lucas leaned toward the man who had stepped away from the table. He whispered something, just a few words, and the man nodded and left with his phone in hand. The other one stayed put, his eyes continually shifting, sweeping every direction. This wasn't a casual dinner between powerful friends. This wasn't just a wealthy man enjoying the sea air in a private booth. This was a meeting, a calculated one. And somehow, I had stepped into the middle of it. I glanced toward Monica. She was speaking to another table now, her voice light and friendly, but her eyes flicked to table 7 more than once. She knew. Or at least, she suspected. Like me, she felt the air tightening, stretched like a violin string on the verge of snapping. I turned away, the empty tray held close to my chest, but the words Lucas had spoken echoed in my mind. No one approaches this table without clearance. And slowly, a realization began to settle in. Tonight, I was no longer just a waitress. I had seen too much, heard enough, and if I wasn't careful, I could become part of something I never imagined myself stepping into. Back at the counter, I washed the tray with trembling hands, but my thoughts wandered, trying to stitch together the mismatched pieces. What I had just witnessed wasn't anything like the usual nights at the Lighthouse Table. Lucas Moretti wasn't simply a distinguished guest. He carried with him a silence that had gravity, and a presence that made even the broad-shouldered men beside him hold their breath. As I stood beneath the faucet, rinsing glasses and watching the stream of water blur my thoughts, Marco walked into the kitchen. Sweat glistened on his forehead, though the room was cool. He wasn't scheduled tonight. I had seen the shift board with my own eyes earlier when I clocked in. "Marco?" I asked softly as he brushed past me like I wasn't even there. Marco had never been warm, but he'd never avoided me either. He opened the fridge, rummaged for something inside, then slammed the door shut. His eyes swept the kitchen before he walked quickly into the dining room. And in that moment, everything in me went still. I lifted my head from the faucet and glanced through the small window that offered a narrow view of the dining room. Marco was walking quickly toward table 7, a tray in his arms, but something was off. It wasn't how we were trained to carry it. His movements lacked the balance we all instinctively maintained. His right arm was tense, slightly drawn in, his hand curled as if gripping something hidden beneath his jacket. The unease that had been fluttering faintly in my chest sharpened into certainty. Something was wrong, deeply, unmistakably wrong. My heart pounded violently. I didn't know where the courage came from. I only knew my feet were already moving before thought could catch up. I stepped around the counter, walking quickly but not rushing, slipping between tables and murmured conversations until I neared table 7. Lucas remained seated, one hand wrapped around a wine glass, the other resting loosely on the table. The bodyguard nearby didn't seem to have registered anything yet. Marco was almost there now, his smile frozen across his face, the kind of smile that looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror a few too many times. I didn't think. I leaned toward Lucas, as if to ask about dessert, but my voice barely rose above a whisper. "Don't move." I said it softly, only for him. My hand slipped beneath the table, found his, and squeezed. He didn't turn, didn't speak, but his hand closed over mine with a strength that nearly hurt. He understood. Marco approached the table, still smiling. But now it was a brittle thing, no longer human. "Chef's special appetizer," he announced as he placed the tray down, but his left hand never left the pocket of his coat. As he leaned down to arrange the plate, I saw his left hand emerge. Pinched between his fingers was a small glass vial of clear liquid. He was moving to empty it into Lucas's glass of wine, which sat untouched. The bodyguard began to move, but it was too slow. I acted first. I tripped, knocking over Lucas's glass of wine. The dark red liquid splashed across the table, scattering ice and liquid over Lucas's shirt. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I said loudly, grabbing a napkin, leaning across Lucas. It worked. One of them lunged forward, seizing Marco's wrist and wrenching it. The small glass vial slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The air turned to ice. Marco was restrained. His face had lost all color, lips pressed tight as though keeping something buried deep inside. The air turned to ice. Marco was restrained. His face had lost all color, lips pressed tight as though keeping something buried deep inside. But the noise of the room fell away from me. Everything slowed. Everything blurred. Lucas rose, calmly but with purpose, placing a hand lightly on my back, his body angled to shield me from the curious glances now beginning to rise like ripples. "We're leaving." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. I shook my head instinctively. "I have a shift. I can't just—" "He saw your face," Lucas said, his voice low, stripped of softness. "He knows you warned me. How long do you think you'll stay safe?" His words cut through every hesitation. I didn't know why I warned him. It wasn't some ingrained customer service reflex. It was something older, deeper, a raw instinct I hadn't questioned. But now, I saw what it had cost. Lucas guided me out the back of the restaurant just as the static of radios and low voices began to rise out front. A black car waited in the alley. He opened the door for me, then slid in beside me. The door shut with a quiet finality. Through the window, I looked back once more. The warm amber lights of the Lighthouse Table were fading behind the misty glass. In less than 15 minutes, the life I had spent years building quiet, invisible, steady, was gone. And in its place, I was being pulled into the orbit of a man I didn't understand, but could no longer walk away from. Inside the restaurant, the stir began to swell, like the first tremor of a wave that could not be stopped. A few guests rose, glancing nervously around. The manager emerged from behind the bar, his face flushed with anxiety. Another server tried to calm the crowd with a crooked smile, muttering something about a kitchen accident, but no one believed it. Everyone knew something was wrong. Marco had been taken out the back, his head bowed low, his arms locked in the firm grip of Lucas's men, and I could still hear the sound of that glass breaking at my feet, the splash of ice water clinging to the sleeves of my shirt, freezing against my skin. Every sense I had felt strangled, and in that one moment, I had stepped beyond my own fear. I had pushed through the armor of invisibility I wore so carefully each day, and in return, I had traded safety for something irreversible, a single, instinctive act, and everything had changed. Lucas stood very close to me, one hand resting lightly at the bend of my elbow, just enough to keep me from walking away without ever making me feel forced. "Let's go," he said again, this time softer, but no less firm. I opened my mouth, ready to object, but then I remembered the look in Marco's eyes just before they restrained him. There was no fear in that look, only silence. The silence of someone who knew they hadn't acted alone. I nodded without speaking. Lucas signaled to a man in a black suit, who immediately moved ahead, leading us down the narrow hallway toward the back exit of the restaurant. I walked beside Lucas, each step feeling like I was crossing some invisible threshold, leaving behind everything I understood for something else entirely. The door swung open. The cold, salty night air from the sea rushed in, and I shivered without meaning to. A sleek black car waited at the curb, engine already running, headlights casting long streaks of light across the wet pavement. The driver stood ready, opening the rear door. Lucas said nothing more. He placed his hand gently on my back, firm but careful, as though he sensed I might hesitate. I glanced once toward the dark alley behind the restaurant, where trash bins were stacked against the wall, the very spot I used to slip away for a moment's peace during long shifts. That alley, that whole world, suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, to a life that had just slipped out of reach. I stepped into the car. Inside, the warmth wrapped around me instantly. The leather seats were smooth and soft, the air faintly scented with mint and clean upholstery. Lucas slid in beside me. The door shut behind him, and the car pulled away, gliding down the familiar street that already felt like a memory. "I can't go," I said suddenly, my voice trembling as my hand flew to the door handle. My mother is at home. She's sick. I have to go back." Lucas didn't look at me. He signaled the driver. "To the villa." Then, he turned to me, his eyes cold but focused. "They are secure." I froze. "Secure? What are you talking about? How could you—" The moment Marco was apprehended, I made a call, Lucas said, his voice flat. I knew he wasn't acting alone. "A team of mine, including a private nurse, arrived at your apartment 10 minutes ago. They are moving your son and mother to a safe location now. They will be well cared for." His words sent a chill down my spine that was colder than his gaze. He knew where I lived. He knew about my family. The panic for my son subsided, only to be replaced by a new, deeper fear. I looked back through the window and watched the warm golden glow of the Lighthouse Table vanish into the fog. In less than 15 minutes, the quiet, invisible life I had spent years building was gone, pulled from under my feet, replaced by the orbit of a man I didn't know, but to whom I was now tethered in ways I couldn't yet understand. For several long minutes, Lucas didn't speak. He stared ahead, jaw clenched, as if calculating something I had no way of grasping. Finally, he broke the silence, voice low and steady. "You can't go back there." I turned toward him, confusion pressing against my ribs. "Because I saw too much?" Lucas didn't nod. He didn't deny it either. "That man wasn't acting alone," he said. "If you hadn't warned me, he would have had time to inject that into my food." I shuddered. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't want to know. I didn't ask what would have happened if I hadn't stepped in. "Why me?" I asked, barely a whisper. He turned and looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time since we left. "I don't know yet. Maybe fate, maybe a mistake, but either way I won't let you pay the price for something you didn't choose." I didn't respond. All I knew was that I had crossed into something far larger than myself. And from this moment on, there was no going back. The car moved silently along the coastal roads, streetlights sliding past the windows like pale streaks of gold in the fog. I sat still, hands clasped tightly on my lap. No one spoke. Only the soft hum of the engine and the distant rhythm of waves kept time with the silence. When the car finally turned onto a long, winding stone driveway, I realized we had left town altogether. Tall trees whispered in the wind on either side, and the faint glow of lamplight marked the path ahead. At the end of the drive stood a large house, quiet and solid like a painting done in deep oils. Black slate roof, wide windows draped in heavy curtains. It looked both safe and ominous, and my chest tightened with a sense of something I couldn't name. The driver pulled up to the front steps and stopped. Before I could move, Lucas was already opening the door, his hand extended as if it were routine. I hesitated only a moment before placing my hand in his. His palm was warm, steady, and so sure it made me feel small and breakable by contrast. He led me into a wide entry hall. Dark wood floors gleamed beneath our feet, and a high ceiling arched above us, from which a crystal chandelier glowed quietly. The house was silent, but not cold. It was the kind of silence that came from intention. Everything in this place had been arranged with care. A woman stepped out from a hallway to the left. She was older, dressed in a tailored gray uniform, her hair pulled into a neat bun, petite in frame, but her eyes were sharp, watchful. "This is Mrs. Vega," Lucas said. "She'll prepare a room for you." Mrs. Vega nodded at me, polite but without warmth. "Upstairs, south wing. I'll have someone bring fresh clothes. If you need anything, just call." I nodded awkwardly, not trusting my voice yet, but Lucas spoke again before she could leave. "Leave it. I'll take her myself." A staircase curved gently up to the second floor. Each step creaked softly beneath our feet, as though the house itself was listening. Lucas walked ahead, never looking back. The hallway stretched long and quiet, lit only by sconces on the walls. The room he opened was at the far end, pale cream door, polished brass handle. He pushed it open and stepped aside for me to enter. The room was larger than I expected. A king-sized bed covered in crisp white linens, windows that opened toward the sea, where the curtains stirred faintly in the breeze, a writing desk with a lamp, a small bookshelf, and an armchair beside the fireplace. I stepped inside slowly, feeling as though I had just crossed the final line into another world, a world without the smell of kitchen grease, without the rattling breath of my mother in the dark, a world I didn't ask for, but was now standing in, with the door closed quietly behind me. Lucas leaned against the doorway, one hand tucked casually into his pocket. "You'll stay here for a few days, until I'm certain no one's looking for you anymore." I turned to face him, trying to hold on to a sense of composure. "I don't understand. I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything." "That's exactly why you're dangerous," he said. "You don't belong to my world. But you've seen too much. And there are people out there who can't tell the difference between an accident and a threat." I said nothing. He wasn't wrong, but what unsettled me more than anything was the realization that I had stepped into unfamiliar territory without ever being given a choice. Lucas watched me for a few more seconds, then nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." He turned and left, the sound of the door closing behind him sealing me into a room that wasn't mine. And for the first time in years, I didn't hear the television murmuring in the background, or the wind sneaking in through the cracked window, or my mother calling my name in her sleep. There was only the sound of the sea, restless and distant, colliding with the cliffs beyond the walls. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands still trembling. I had crossed into a world that was never meant to include me, and Lucas Moretti was the only one with the key to let me out. Or keep me locked inside forever. The next morning, I woke to a quiet so deep it felt unreal. Soft daylight spilled into the room, and the curtains had been gently drawn aside by someone I hadn't heard. Beyond the window, the fog-draped coastline lay still under the early sun, the sea glowing faintly at the edge of the hill. It took me a few seconds to remember why I was here, in a house far too beautiful to ever exist in my own imagining. Everything had happened in a blur. The warning, the syringe, the chaos, the black car, and finally, the heavy silence that fell over the night like a closing curtain. I rose slowly, my bare feet touching the cool wood floor. A clean outfit had been placed on the chair. Everything fit as if it had been chosen long before I ever arrived. Lucas didn't appear that morning. Instead, it was Mrs. Vega who met me, guiding me to breakfast in a small room near the kitchen, where sunlight warmed the old oak floors, and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with wood and quiet. The food was simple, but so good, it felt like something out of a film. I ate in silence, my mind still scattered, unsure which part of this was real, and which part might unravel if I blinked too hard. Afterward, Mrs. Vega led me outside. She didn't ask questions. She didn't explain. She simply said Lucas wanted me to go with them to the house on the mountain. I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't dare ask. A black SUV was waiting. The driver, dressed in a gray suit, never looked at me. Not once. We left the seaside estate behind, following a quiet road that soon gave way to a shaded path, thick with trees. The road climbed gently at first, then began to wind higher into the hills. Each turned steeper, narrower. The silence deepened as we rose. Only the crunch of tires on gravel and the distant call of forest birds filled the space. It took nearly 30 minutes to reach the house, and when it appeared, I knew instantly it wasn't like the villa below. This place had weight, built of stone and draped in moss, its dark roof pressed low against a forested sky. Thick oak-framed windows, a door like the entrance to an old stronghold. It looked like a forgotten fortress nestled into the woods, and yet, something about it felt strangely familiar. I couldn't say why. The driver opened my door, then silently led me inside. The house was unnervingly still. No voices, no footsteps, just the quiet echo of my own as I followed the driver down the long western corridor. When we reached a door tucked deep into the hallway, he opened it wordlessly, and then disappeared without a sound. The room was shaped like an old-world library, lined with towering bookshelves filled with worn leather-bound volumes, their spines faded with time. A large wooden desk stood at the center, anchored by a pair of aged burgundy leather chairs, their edges rubbed raw by decades of use. I stepped toward the desk, intending to find a way to excuse myself and retreat, but a file folder resting neatly on the desktop stopped me cold. There was nothing unusual about it. A standard file, tied shut with a faded cord, but one corner of the top page had slipped out just enough for a name to show: Joseph Beaumont. I froze. That name didn't belong here. It belonged to a quiet man in a quiet town. My father, without question. Hands trembling, I untied the folder and opened it. Inside were sheets of paper, some crisp, others yellowed by age, contracts, photographs, bank receipts, a few handwritten pages signed with my father's name. I turned each page carefully, trying to make sense of them, but my thoughts refused to organize. Some documents listed an organization identified only by a strange code. Others referenced meetings that had taken place in this very estate again and again, and even included detailed records of conversations with someone titled simply as the head. One page, written hastily in blue ink, bore a line that pulled the air from my lungs. Trust no one, not even the messenger. Deliver all documents if anything happens. I staggered back. It was as if I had just uncovered a version of my father I never knew existed. The same man who spent his life fixing boilers, holding my mother's hand through illness, and eventually fading quietly into death, leaving behind nothing but an old wristwatch and a short letter. I never imagined he had secrets. And now, they were unraveling before me, layer by layer, like fog clearing from a long-forgotten road. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Lucas stood in the doorway, light from the corridor casting sharp lines across his face. "You've seen it," he said. He didn't need to ask. I turned to face him, still too stunned to form words. "He wasn't just your father," Lucas went on. "He was one of the people entrusted with some of the organization's deepest secrets." I looked back at the folder, then at Lucas, and the fear inside me gave way to something heavier, a silence with weight, the kind that comes when the world you thought you knew crumbles, and nothing rises to replace it. I realized then that my life, from this point forward, was no longer mine in the way it once had been. I stood still in the dust-softened quiet of that room, eyes resting on the file that bore my father's name, Joseph Beaumont, a name I had once tied to slow evenings around the dinner table, to calloused hands that held mine during my mother's worst nights, to the rasp of his cough in the small house at the edge of town where my childhood survived on modesty and quiet love. And now, that same name sat at the center of cold typewritten pages, linked to secret meetings, to classified codes, to a world I never imagined he belonged to. I didn't ask Lucas anything more. I didn't have the strength. When he left, leaving me alone in the library, I sat down in the wooden chair beside the desk, my hands clasped in my lap as though holding onto the last trace of warmth from a life I no longer recognized. I turned through the remaining pages, searching for something that might help me understand who my father had truly been. And then, tucked between two brittle documents, I found a pale envelope. No return address, no postmark. Only a single line written in handwriting I knew better than my own heartbeat. Asterisk. For Claire, if you're reading this. Asterisk. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. One was a handwritten will, the notary seal faint with age, naming me as the sole beneficiary of all personal assets, including, to my disbelief, a listed share in the property in the Western Highlands, which I now realized meant this house. The second was a letter. The writing trembled but remained legible, like it had been written in the final days of a life that was failing in body but not in clarity. Claire, my dear girl, if you're reading this, then it means I've failed to keep the promise I made, that you would never have to know the darker side of my life. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the years of silence, for the questions left unanswered, but please believe me when I say everything I did for you. I kept a secret for nearly half a lifetime, not out of fear, but to protect you from a burden you should never have had to carry. I once worked for an organization that today is known by many names, but to me, it was simply a youthful choice. A path I walked long ago, a chapter of my life I tried to seal away. When your mother died, I wanted to leave it all behind, but they wouldn't let me go. I spent the rest of my days trying to keep you at the edge of it all, away from their reach, away from the truth, but life doesn't always bend to our wishes. And now, the truth has found you. You have the right to know, and you have the right to choose to walk away, or to step forward. But if you choose to step forward, you must be strong, Claire. Strong in the way that only those who know what they're fighting for can be, because survival doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the ones who understand why they must endure. End quote. I read his words again and again, each line carving itself deeper into me like a blade honed by time and sorrow. I didn't know when the tears had started, only that they were there now, falling silently, soaking the letter until the ink began to blur. All my life, I'd believed my father was a quiet man, withdrawn and burdened by some unnamed sadness. I thought the silence came from grief, from years of hard work and loss. But now I knew better. That silence was not just grief, it was weight. It was the shape of a secret wrapped in the armor of love. I placed the letter back into its envelope, careful, reverent, as though cradling a piece of his soul. Then I looked around the room once more, the books, the desk, the dust hanging like memory in the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a bystander pulled into someone else's hidden world. I was Joseph Beaumont's daughter, and the truth had chosen me long before I ever had the chance to choose anything for myself. I sat there for a long time after, unmoving, as if the room had been emptied of air and left me suspended between what I knew and what I could no longer unknow. His name echoed in my mind, over and over, ringing against the walls of memory, now laced with things I never saw coming. The final lines of his letter lingered in my chest, engraved like a carving in stone. You must be strong, Claire. The door behind me opened quietly. I didn't need to look to know it was Lucas. His footsteps were slow, measured, respectful of the space I was struggling to hold together. I didn't raise my head. My hands clutched the envelope tightly, like a lifeline stretched between past and present. Lucas came to stand near the desk, his eyes glancing over the scattered documents I hadn't yet brought myself to organize. I assume you've read it all, he said, his voice absent of pity or pressure. I nodded. I thought I knew who my father was, I whispered. But he lived 2 lives, and I only ever saw one. Lucas was silent for a beat, then sat across from me, easing into the chair like someone preparing for a long conversation. Joseph wasn't like the others, he said quietly. He joined when he was young, at a time when the lines between right and wrong weren't as defined as they are now. He was one of the few who came in with ideals, but ideals don't survive reality unchanged. I studied him, searching for truth beneath his words, but his gaze didn't flinch. What was he, in the organization? I asked, my voice rough. A record keeper, Lucas answered, but not just an accountant. He had access to internal files, financial operations, lists of transactions. He knew everything. Where the money went. Who pulled the strings. Who controlled the routes. Why did he leave? Lucas exhaled slowly. After your mother died, something in him shifted. He didn't want you growing up under the shadow of violence, lies, and fear. He asked to leave, which is something almost no one does. And he was allowed? Not completely. They let him live, but in exchange, he had to vanish, erased from the system. No contact, no trace, and above all, no disclosure. I clenched the letter tightly in my hands. Then why am I here? I asked, my voice low, the weight of everything pressing down on each word. Why show me all of this? Lucas looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that wasn't power or control. It was something quieter. Respect. Because you saved my life, he said simply, and because you deserve to know the truth. Joseph wasn't just a name in a file. He was the only man I've ever seen stand in front of Victor without flinching. He protected me when I was still a kid, when I didn't know anything about the world I was being born into. You owed him? I asked. No, Lucas answered, his voice soft but certain. I respected him, and I want to protect his daughter not out of obligation, but because he was the first man who ever taught me that real strength doesn't come from the barrel of a gun. It comes from keeping your word. I fell silent. Something in me collapsed then, quietly, and yet something else rose up in its place, something deeper than grief. If my father had truly been the man Lucas described, then I could no longer stay on the sidelines. And I began to understand that meeting Lucas wasn't a coincidence. It was the second bell, and this time, it was ringing for me. We didn't leave the room right away after that. We stayed, both of us silent, each wrapped in our own thoughts, though I sensed we were thinking of the same man, Joseph Beaumont, the man I had once thought of as just my father, a quiet, kind, and soft-spoken man who never raised his voice and never seemed to ask for anything. Now he was something else entirely. The thread tying me to this world I never meant to enter, the name that echoed between me and the storm Lucas had spent years carrying. I looked at Lucas again. In the soft light spilling through the narrow window, his face didn't look as cold as it had that night in the restaurant. The harsh lines had softened. The relentless edge was dulled by something more human, fatigue. And when he spoke again, his voice didn't belong to a man issuing commands. It was the voice of someone revisiting something old and painful. I grew up in a family where there was no such thing as right or wrong, he said quietly. Only strong and weak. My father ran the southern port. His word was law, even at the dinner table. My mother never argued. She existed in his shadow until the day she died of a stroke no one had time to call help for. Lucas stared into the distance, not looking at me, not really looking at anything. His voice was steady, but it held a rawness I hadn't heard before. I was 11 the first time I saw a man tortured, he said, all because he mishandled a shipment. I was standing at the end of the hall. No one noticed me, but the sound screaming, bones breaking they never left. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Maybe silence was what he needed. And maybe silence was what connected us both to the same man. Lucas continued, as if something had unlocked in him, and now there was no closing the door. I met Joseph when I was 19. He was the only one in the organization who ever dared to tell my father he was wrong. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He laid out the numbers, the consequences, the logic, until even my father had to stop and listen. He paused, then glanced at me. And this time, his gaze was gentler. "Joseph told me once," he said, "that people aren't born to live in the shadow of their parents, and that if you ever want to step out of that shadow, you have to be willing to walk alone through a lot of long, dark nights." And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a memory. It was a truth he had carried for years. And now, he was handing it to me. My throat tightened until I could hardly breathe. I knew that feeling too well. I had lived my whole youth inside the shadow of pain. My mother had been ill for as long as my memory reached. My father had been quiet and devoted, yet he always turned away whenever I asked about his past. I worked 2 jobs to raise my son, not because I was strong, but because there was no other choice. For years, I existed like that, not living, only enduring. I used to think that if I stayed silent, if I didn't draw attention, everything would stay peaceful, I said softly. I thought I was protecting my son by disappearing. But silence isn't peace, it's just another way of surrendering. Lucas watched me closely. For the first time, I saw his eyes without their armor. No walls, no masks, just a man searching, like me, for a reason to keep going. "You're not invisible anymore, Claire," he said quietly. "You've stepped into something dangerous, but I won't let you walk through it alone." There was nothing poetic in his words, no promises, no softness, yet they struck something deep within me. I didn't know what waited ahead, but in that instant, I realized I wasn't entirely alone. In this fogged and fractured world we both inhabited, I knew, at least for now, someone had chosen to stay, not out of debt, not out of pity, but out of respect and something unnamed that lived quietly beneath it. Maybe when 2 people who have been broken long enough finally find each other, they don't need promises, they just need presence. And somehow, Lucas Moretti had become the first person to stay when everyone else had only ever left. The morning unfolded like any other in the mountain estate. Pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows, brushing over the wooden floor and the soft rug, lending the illusion of calm to a place that had none. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, my thoughts still drifting in the quiet aftermath of the night before. There was something in the way Lucas had looked at me, not with the eyes of a man accustomed to control, but with the gaze of someone who had known loss and was now searching for whatever unbroken peace might still exist in another soul. I hadn't even taken the first sip when Mrs. Vega knocked. Her face, as always, was composed, but there was something different in her eyes this time, a tension she didn't try to hide. She said nothing, only extended her hand. In it was a small box, wrapped in dull brown paper. No return address, no markings except for 2 words typed in crimson ink across the surface. Asterisk, Claire Beaumont, asterisk. My heart stuttered. A chill ran up my arm the moment I touched it. Mrs. Vega didn't move. She just stood there, eyes fixed on me, as though waiting to see what I would do. I began to unwrap it slowly, each movement deliberate, careful, my hands trembling from something colder than fear. Inside was a plain cardboard box. I lifted the lid, and my heart dropped straight to the pit of my stomach. Nestled inside was a small stuffed bear, worn, faded, and heartbreakingly familiar. The same kind my son used to hold every night before he fell asleep. But it wasn't the toy that stole my breath. It was the folded slip of paper pressed between its paws. I unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was jagged, slashing into the page like a blade. "You think you're being protected, but I haven't forgotten, Claire. Everything you touch will bleed. No signature, no mark, but I didn't need one. I knew exactly who had sent it. Victor." I set the box down on the table and sat motionless, as if turned to stone. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air pressing tighter with each breath. Everything was silent, suffocatingly so, as if even the walls were holding their breath. A part of me wanted to bolt down the stairs, find Lucas, scream at him to get me out of here, to get my son and me far away from this place, from all of it. But another part, the part that had lived long enough to understand how thin the shell of silence really was, could only sit still and let the fear seep into my veins. Lucas arrived only minutes later. No one had called him. Maybe Mrs. Vega had said something, or maybe he simply sensed what hung in the air like smoke. The moment he saw the box on the table, his eyes darkened. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice low. "Mrs. Vega just gave it to me," I stammered. Lucas looked at Mrs. Vega, who stood by the door. "When your team arrived at her apartment to retrieve the family," Mrs. Vega explained, her voice even, "this was already there, planted on the child's bed. Our men brought it back." Lucas picked up the small stuffed bear, then stared at the note. His hand closed around it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Victor's sending a message," he said, his voice hardening. He wants you to know he was there. He knew about you and your son long before tonight. My breath hitched. That was worse. It meant Marco wasn't the beginning. I had been watched for a long time. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I forced myself to breathe deeper, slower. I couldn't afford to unravel now. What do we do? I asked. Lucas didn't answer right away. He looked at me, and in his eyes I didn't just see anger, I saw something else. Resolve. The kind that comes from a man who has already lost too much and knows he can't afford to lose again. We do the one thing he won't expect, Lucas said finally, his voice steady, deliberate. We don't run. I didn't know if that was the right answer. I didn't know if it was courage or foolishness, but when his eyes met mine, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If I kept running, if I disappeared from my own life again, it would only be a matter of time before I lost everything. But if I stayed, if I stood my ground alongside Lucas, I still had a chance, however small, to protect the one thing that mattered most. And now I understood. Victor wasn't just threatening me. He was inviting me into the game. But this time, I wouldn't be playing alone. That night, I sat alone on the second-floor balcony, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold, my gaze fixed on the distant folds of forest, swallowed in a heavy mist that blanketed the mountains like secrets never meant to surface. The soft chorus of insects rose steadily from below, a quiet reminder that beyond these walls, the world continued to turn indifferent and cold. Inside, on the small table just beyond the threshold, the worn stuffed bear still sat where I had left it, its silence louder than any threat. Victor had found a way to reach into my past, and if he truly wanted to, there was nothing beyond his grasp. I thought of my son, his face, peaceful as he drifted to sleep on my shoulder during nights when there was no one else but the two of us. I had once sworn I would protect him from everything, and now I was the one bringing danger closer than ever. I heard footsteps behind me. Lucas didn't speak as he stepped onto the balcony. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets, eyes also fixed on the horizon fading into night. He didn't have to ask. He already knew what was going through my mind, and I didn't have to look at him to know he was waiting for my decision. I could leave, I said quietly, but clearly. Disappear. Change our names. Take my son somewhere far away. I've done it before. I could do it again. Lucas said nothing. I turned to face him, meeting his gaze. But I don't want to live like that anymore, I said. Running isn't living. It's just surviving. And I'm tired of just surviving. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing not with doubt, but with recognition. I drew in a steady breath, clutching the mug in my hands like it anchored this new resolve rising inside me. I'm not going anywhere, Lucas. I'm done running. Whatever happens next, I'll face it. With you. He studied me for a long time, then slowly nodded. You know this could make things more dangerous. I know, I said, without hesitation. But I also know this: if I keep running, I'll lose myself. And what would I be teaching my son if I'm the first one to give up? Lucas rested his hands on the railing. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke, his voice low and solid as stone. Then from this moment on, you're not standing alone. We do this together. The mountain wind swept past us, sharp with pine and earth, slipping down the back of my collar, but I didn't feel the cold. For the first time in years, I felt strong enough to rise, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had chosen something that mattered more than fear. And in that moment, with Lucas beside me not as a savior, but as someone willing to walk beside me, I stepped into a new chapter. A chapter not promised to be safe, but one carved from truth, anchored in courage, and shaped by choices no longer made out of fear, but out of hope. 2 days after I told Lucas I would no longer run, we began to move. The vague words and cautious conversations faded. Everything became real, precise, actionable. They brought me back to the library in the mountain house, the place where my father had once kept everything he deemed important. Mrs. Vega had preserved the room immaculately over the years, not a speck of dust on the shelves, as if she had known. One day, I would return to open it. The documents, contracts, memos, photographs, even old tape recordings, were stored neatly in a safe hidden behind a faded landscape painting in the corner of the room. Lucas stood beside me as I unlocked it. He didn't speak, didn't rush me. He simply watched, giving me the space to decide for myself how far I was ready to go. I sifted through each stack of papers slowly, the weight of the secrets my father had protected pressing into my hands. There were names I vaguely remembered from overheard conversations at the restaurant, encrypted financial transactions, snippets of conversations between my father and a man identified only by the letter V. I didn't need Lucas to confirm it. I already knew. Victor. In a silver-gray folder tucked near the bottom, I found what Lucas would later call the missing piece. It was a detailed ledger of dark money funds funneled through shell companies, each one leading back to Victor and 3 other senior members of the organization. Every transfer was backed by receipts, signatures, and bank accounts. It wasn't just a trail, it was a map, a blueprint of the network Victor had built to maintain his grip on power and to punish anyone who dared to challenge it. I closed the file, my fingers trembling. I don't know if I can get through all of this without losing my mind. Lucas placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and firm. You don't have to do it alone. That same day, Lucas called in his 3 most trusted allies. They arrived at the estate within 12 hours. No fanfare, no trace. One handled data, one managed finance. The third had once been Joseph's right hand before he disappeared from the world. They gathered in the lower-level conference room, sitting around a long table that had not seen purpose in years. I stayed near the top of the stairs, listening, unseen. I didn't belong to their world, but I knew I was the key that unlocked the final door. Lucas laid out the plan with absolute clarity. There was no hesitation. He would use the evidence Joseph had left behind, combine it with current internal intelligence, and strike, not with violence, not with spectacle, but with precision. A single blow to Victor's greatest vulnerabilities: money and trust. 2 nights later, the chain began to unravel, link by link, as if some long-buried machine of justice had been quietly set into motion. Victor's accounts were frozen. 2 of his shell companies were raided in unannounced audits. One of his 3 inner-circle allies abruptly withdrew, liquidating his assets and transferring everything overseas. The threatening messages from Victor ceased without warning. No more cryptic notes. No more chilling whispers left in mailboxes. His network trembled. Those who once bowed without question began to doubt. Lucas wasted no time. He met directly with key figures in the organization, not to ask permission, but to deliver a choice. If they wished to stay, they had to step into the light. If they chose to shield Victor, they would face the consequences. And for the first time, I saw a world I had once believed was ruled only by blood and bullets shake beneath something I never thought could hold such power: the truth. That evening, once the house had emptied and the meetings were over, Lucas stepped onto the balcony where I so often sat alone. He handed me a glass of red wine, the kind I used to avoid, thinking it belonged to someone else's life. "We're only halfway through," he said, his eyes on the pine forest below. "But this is the most dangerous part." I nodded. "At least this time, I'm not walking it alone." Lucas didn't reply, but in the quiet that followed, his gaze told me everything. He understood that what I had said wasn't just for him. It was for the man who had left me a truth strong enough to carry forward, not as a victim, but as someone who chose to rise. 3 days after Lucas struck Victor's financial lifeline, the first report arrived. One of the shell companies used for laundering was completely shut down. Every bank account tied to it was frozen. The legal owner vanished from the city, leaving behind a trail too obvious to ignore. Lucas didn't speak when he read the file, but something shifted behind his eyes. Not triumph, not relief, but something more primal. A kind of alertness honed by years of surviving in a world where only the cunning endure. It wasn't over, and he knew it. A storm had begun, and Victor was not the kind of man who vanished quietly into defeat. News that Victor had fled his riverside estate was confirmed on the 4th afternoon. He took with him only his most loyal circle, disappearing without a trace, despite every road being watched and every signal tracked. Lucas sat in the library, hunched over a wide map stretched across the table. Red pins marked every known stronghold still standing. I sat across from him, watching the slow current of calculation move through his thoughts. "He won't stay hidden," Lucas said. "Not because he can't, because he's too arrogant to lose quietly." He was right. And less than 24 hours later, Victor reappeared, not with a phone call, not with a threat. He returned with violence. A coordinated strike on one of Lucas's communication outposts. 3 people wounded, 1 missing. For the first time since I met Lucas, I saw him truly angry. Not the explosive kind of rage, but the kind that simmers like lava beneath a thick layer of stone. Lucas didn't speak, didn't rush to give orders. He simply stood there, eyes fixed on the files being brought in, the photos from the scene, the lines of encrypted messages. Then he turned to me. He's trying to push me to the edge. He wants me to react like he would. But I made a promise. I didn't need him to say who he had promised. It was the vow he once whispered to me on the balcony that he wouldn't let things spiral back into bloodshed. And the promise he made long ago to Joseph Beaumont, the man who believed there was another way to cleanse darkness without being consumed by it. Lucas issued the final order at dawn. A covert operation, no gunfire, no bloodshed, relying solely on the information and power now at his command. When Victor was captured at an abandoned farm near the border, he wasn't carrying a weapon, but his face was full of defiance. I was there when they brought him back to the old estate, where Lucas was waiting. The afternoon light streamed through the large window, casting shadows on the faces of two men who once shared the same path but now stood on opposite ends of it. Victor smirked. "Thought you'd be the one to finish me. Or at least let your men do it." Lucas didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. His voice was low, but steady. "I could, but if I did, I'd be no different from you. And I promised I won't break that for someone like you." Victor was taken away shortly after. No one laid another hand on him. No blood, no execution, just an ending that honored what my father once believed in. In a world where darkness seemed to rule all, someone still chose to hold on to a sliver of light. And Lucas Moretti, by refusing that final act, held on to the piece of humanity he had nearly lost. As for me, I knew that was the moment I truly trusted him. Not because he was powerful, but because he chose not to use his power when he could have. And that made him more trustworthy than anyone else. I stood on the wooden porch, where morning mist still clung to the railing and the pine trees whispered in the wind. Sunlight filtered through thin layers of clouds, casting a gentle glow over the valley below, where life went on as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. Victor had been taken away. The network he once controlled had been dismantled, and Lucas, the man who once belonged to the shadows, had kept his word. He chose light, not just for himself, but for the people he had vowed to protect. When Lucas asked if I wanted to leave, to walk away from everything that had just happened, I looked at him for a long time. Maybe somewhere else I could live a quieter life. But then I realized, peace doesn't come from where you live. It comes from how you choose to live. And I no longer wanted to run. I had faced it. I had made a choice. And this time, I chose to stay. To stay and build something new from the old, fractured pieces. To stay not because I needed protection, but because I wanted to become someone who could protect herself and those she loved. Life doesn't always hand us straight paths. Sometimes it throws us into dead ends, sharp turns, and trials that test everything we are. But it's in those turns that we discover who we are. And if we can stand up and keep walking, we don't just survive, we live with purpose. Claire's story is not simply a battle between right and wrong, between light and darkness. It is a story about choice, about the courage to face fear, and above all, about love. The love of a daughter for her father, the love of a mother for her child, and the quiet, enduring love between two people who were once broken, once lost, but ultimately found each other at the intersection of understanding and grace. Sometimes, the most precious things don't come from victory, but from forgiveness. And sometimes, strength is not about defeating the enemy, but about refusing to let hatred define who we are. Dear friend, if you've stayed with me to the very end of this story, I truly want to know how it made you feel. Did Claire's journey stir something within you? Have you ever faced impossible choices? Have you ever felt the urge to run away from your own life? If so, please share your thoughts with me in the comments below. I would love to hear from you, to hear something real from deep within your heart. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing to Dear Single Mom, so that each day, you can walk with us through other emotional journeys, through real-life stories that carry meaning and weight. Don't forget to like and share this video, so we can spread these human truths to more people. Thank you for giving your precious time to listen. I'll see you in the next video with a brand new story just as deep, just as moving, and just as full of life's lessons. I wish you good health, joy in your days, peace in your heart, and hope in every sunrise. Until next time, goodbye.